Welcome, everybody. Jonathan Zuck and George Garos is on the call. We're just doing a follow-up on the call we had that was chaired by Jonathan this morning. And I'll turn it over to Jonathan to recap. And George had a number of things he wanted to elaborate on. So I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Sorry, it cut out in the middle, but I think you wanted to start with George maybe, right?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Unless you want to just start a recap of where the conversation was going. I know George had particularly wanted to elaborate. So if you want to level set the conversation, then let George segue in, that's fine too. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. Okay. Hi, folks. For everyone that's listening to the recording, this is Jonathan Zuck, the co-chair of the Consolidated Policy Working Group of the At-Large. And we began what will probably be a long conversation this morning on the renewal of a number of different registry agreements that attempt to bring them more in line with the existing registry agreements that were used for the new gTLDs in the 2012 round. And so a lot of this is an exercise on the part of ICANN to move toward a more standardized version of the registry agreements. At issue are two big points. One has to do with fees and how caps should be used and if they should be used, et cetera, on the wholesale price of TLDs, because there are not pricing restrictions on the new gTLDs, but there are on all of the legacy, the 22 TLDs that existed prior to the 2012 round. The second issue is that there was a new form of rights protection mechanism that was introduced as part of the new gTLD program in 2012 called Uniform Rapid Suspension, which was meant to be a more expedited version of something that people call the UDRP, which is a process has been managed largely by WIPO for intellectual property owners to challenge the registration of a domain that impinges on their trademark. And so the URS is a new, lighter touch, but also, as I'm sure George will point out, lower burden process for trademark owners to try and keep their trademark names from getting registered. So those are the big topics of discussion for today. And as I said, both of these issues are addressed in a certain way in the new gTLD round. And this is about older agreements like .asia, .info, .biz, et cetera, .org, and whether or not and how they should be brought forward into this new regime of these new registry agreements. With that, I'll turn it over to George.
Thanks, Jonathan. As we were discussing on the CPWG working group, call, there's two big issues: the imposition of the URS and the unlimited price caps in these new proposed agreements that ICANN and the registry operators have negotiated for these legacy TLDs. And in my view, it's been a big dereliction of ICANN's duties to put these forward, because they're not really considering the needs of all stakeholders who are materially affected, in particular registrants. They basically did a massive giveaway to the registry operators by putting forth this proposal. So let me talk about the URS first. Not too many people are familiar with that rights protection mechanism, but to put it in context, back before the new gTLDs launched, there was a lot of fear mongering going on about how, the sky is falling and, the end of the world is coming, and there's going to be billions and billions of dollars worth of damages to trademark holders if unlimited numbers of new gTLDs were launched. And there was testimony to that effect for the US government, and I posted a link in the Zoom chat. I'm not sure if everybody listening to this can see that chat, but there are lots of predictions before the new gTLDs launched, and now that we have the evidence, it's clear that those predictions were mostly wrong. And so that was the context that these rights protection mechanisms were adopted. And registry operators were kind of forced to adopt them because the trademark holders were going to hold up the process until they got what they wanted. And so they did eventually get what they wanted, which was unbalanced rights protection mechanisms that really put registrants at a severe disadvantage in terms of having whether you want a level playing field or not. Let me give you some examples of problems with the URS and why registrants should be concerned. And there've been about 1,000 URS cases in the last few years, which is something that the RPM PDP working group has been studying. And that kind of goes to show that ICANN is operating here in a top-down manner instead of respecting the bottom-up process that is actually reviewing the data on these rights protection mechanisms by simply imposing the URS in a top-down manner, despite the fact that the GNSO is actively engaged in a working group that is reviewing this. Not too many people are aware, perhaps, that the language of the URS is always in English, which should probably be a concern given that most of the new gTLDs have registrations with registrants from China. They're by far the dominant registrants. And so having the default in English for the language of the dispute puts registrants that don't understand English at a huge disadvantage. And the justification for that policy was that it would keep the costs low, but it's really keeping the cost low for a certain segment of the in terms of stakeholders, namely American-based or European-based trademark holders with lawyers that speak English, and having panelists that are predominantly at National Arbitration Forum, where English is the dominant language. So it wasn't really respecting all stakeholders equally. It was saying English is the language of the disputes, period. And so one of the proposals that I put forth in the URS for the URS in terms of improving it in the RPM PDP working group is to adopt the same language standards as the UDRP, or the language of the dispute would be the language of the registration agreement. So if you have a Chinese registrar, a registrant from China obviously would have to understand the registration agreement. And so having the dispute be in Chinese makes sense. Same for, if they're Portuguese, they have a Brazilian registrar or a Portuguese registrar. If they're French, they're a French registrar. That's like such a basic thing, due process, being able to understand a dispute. It's kind of like, the fact that I even had to raise this as an issue, and it was not me alone. Zach Muscovich of the Internet Commerce Association made that proposal about language jointly. And it was actually very odd that there was a sub-team of the RPM PDP that looked at the same issues of the URS, and they didn't come forth with that language proposal. It kind of shows the degree to which the RPM PDP is captured by trademark interests. That's such a very basic due process issue. Being able to understand the dispute in your native language wasn't put forth by any of the sub-teams. It came to individual proposals like myself and Zach. And so I put forth about 14 proposals of my own, and there's a total of 32 proposals by individuals, as well as various proposals by sub-team members to make improvements in the URS. And trademark holders obviously have their own wish list of proposals. For example, they want to have a loser pays mechanism to change the URS so that the loser of a URS would pay the costs of the dispute. They even have some proposals that are really extremist in my view, namely that if you lose a certain number of URS complaints, you would actually have the rest of your portfolio affected, potentially losing other domains or being unable to register domains in the future. So that's why people should be concerned about this issue of imposing the URS in such a top-down manner. It's not really respecting the multi-stakeholder process. And so I can give you other examples if folks are interested as to why they should be concerned. But the fact that the URS was adopted before seeing the evidence, and now we actually have the evidence and are improving the URS, if it survives, because one of the proposals is that the URS be eliminated as a policy and not be made a consensus policy. the way that this is coming about, just having ICANN impose it top down, is really of concern. So if you had any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but I can go on to the topic of fees if there are no questions.
Oh, why don't I talk a little bit about this topic, and then we'll have you do fees, and that way we're not having people wait too long to get to the topic. Does that make sense, Glenn?
Yeah, that's great. It's a small group. Eduardo's on the call, chair of NARALO, but he doesn't seem to have his hand up. So please proceed. Thank you so much. And by the way, George, that was really good. I appreciate it. Thank you. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, and thanks, George, for laying that out. Again, my name's Jonathan Zuck, and I don't have a horse in this fight, so I'm just sort of taking a position so that we have a fleshed out discussion. Much like the GDPR identified two categories of end users that's led to some very interesting discussions inside the at-large, I think these discussions will as well. In GDPR, those discussions were between registrant and non-registrant end users, and looking at where their interests might diverge or at the very least be different in terms of scope, and how we guided our team on the EPDP with respect to the GDPR was sort of a function of choosing sides there. And I think that we'll have some interesting discussions as this develops in this area as well. And the two categories of users that I want to sort of talk about are high volume purchasers of domain names and more individual or lower volume purchasers of domain names. And so, you know, a typical domain name registrant has got a few domains, and I'm an atypical one. Maybe I have 30 of them, right?
George Kirkus here. Looks like Jonathan got disconnected.
Yeah, let's see if he unfreezes. That's unfortunate. I wonder if I'm going to email him. Just 1 second. In the interim, George, while he's coming through. So if we can. Oh, here he is. We lost you for the last 3 minutes. You froze.
Oh, sorry.
If you can just back up just for about a minute or two, and that'd be great. Well, what you left off was you're unusual, which we know, about the 30 domain names.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes. So I've got about 30 domain names, but there are folks with thousands of domain names, and so the distinction that I think we're going to be focused on to some extent is between sort of the low volume purchasers of domain names and the high volume purchasers. So the high volume purchasers can include large companies that have engaged in a lot of defensive registration, like an eBay or something like that, that's concerned about fraud. But you also have a category of registrants that are investors in domain names. And so they're engaged in building a secondary market for domain names and build huge portfolios of domain names for resale later. And I would say that the two primary characteristics of those large-scale domain purchasers is that they have a great deal of sensitivity to changes because they have so many domains, whether it's a pricing change, as we'll talk about, or in this case, a procedural change. And the other is sort of where they think different responsibilities should lie, which will come up more in the context of fees. But I think there's going to be some characteristics that come to the surface that help to differentiate from a quote unquote typical end user and a high volume registrant. And it's not a clear, bright line between them. There's a lot of overlap in interests, but I think that we'll see that there's these two categories. In the context of the URS, George is right that there was a lot of hyperbole before the new round that was about all the defensive registrations that were going to take place. I think Sony said that they were going to end up spending $10 million or something like that on defensive registrations. And that certainly did not come to pass. And as the former chair of the review on consumer trust, competition, and consumer choice, the CCT review, we looked at these issues and certainly saw that there wasn't the level of defensive registration that folks had been concerned about, but there certainly was a big increase in costs, and it just took place elsewhere. Maybe not the same numbers, but there were more cease and desist. There was more use of things like URS and other proceedings, UDRP proceedings through WIPO, et cetera. When you look at those reports, there certainly was an increased burden on people trying to protect their trademarks as a result of the new gTLD program. It just didn't result specifically in defensive registrations, because I think those companies made a decision that those numbers were just unmanageable with 1,200 new strings, that they would go grab the 3,000 names that they had in COM and get them in every one of those domains, which is what those estimates were based on. So there's still an issue. So we can't talk about it in binary terms, and it's not a very well quantified issue at this point. But certainly the CCT review found that there was an increased burden on these trademark holders. And so the URS is meant to be a lighter form. And so the other thing to remember is that a typical registrant is not engaged in the URS proceeding for the most part, right? It's usually somebody that's trying very hard to get something that's close to a name that is well-known, et cetera. And there are instances in which somebody may be trying to get a general word that happens to be somebody's trademark, like Apple or something like that. But the typical registrant, as I say, I have 30 of them, and I've never been involved in UDRP or US proceeding. And so again, you're going to see categories of people that are more engaged in these processes than other. So that's one point. The second point is that this effort is about trying to make the contracts more in sync. But the contracts are still going to be subject to consensus policy. In other words, if there is outcomes from the rights protection working group that change the nature of the URS, as George suggested very helpfully, that the languages are changed, et cetera, they will change across the board. In other words, if everyone is brought on board to a similar contract, those changes will replicate out through all of those contracts. And we will once again be helped by having a standardized contract instead of everyone having their own customized version. So people bringing on URS at this point isn't the same thing as undermining those discussions, because those discussions are going to continue to take place with respect to the new gTLDs, and those decisions will ripple down and ripple out to these new TLDs. So that's the other issue I wanted to raise with respect to URS, is that I think that there is reform that's needed, and it may involve getting rid of URS, as George said, but those will ripple across. But having a standardized contract, I think, should be a priority for the community.
Great, thank you. So, George, did you want to respond to that before you go on to the fees?
Sure, George Gricos again. In terms of harmonizing the contract, it's interesting that ICANN is choosing to harmonize to the new gTLD contract, which is really the contracts that have been less successful in terms of registrations and so on. Like, people can debate this all they want, but the legacy TLDs are really the ones that have been successful over time. ComNet.org, and to use the model for the future as the new gTLD contract is really an interesting choice, that they would choose the ones that are having problems, failing, seeking subsidies from ICANN, et cetera. I don't want to make a long speech about the success or failure of the gTLD program, but I think most people would say it's been disappointment, and even ICANN's own predictions have been wrong. In terms of the groups that are exposed to the URS, high volume registrants, domain investors and so on. My own company owns about 500 domain names, as people might be aware, really elite ones like math.com, school.com. And I own about, through my company, about 30 .orgs. So about 6% of my portfolio. And I think that's probably typical of many companies, that they own a few hundred domain names, and a certain fraction will be .orgs. And I think what people will see is, because of this, they'll just let a certain fraction of those .orgs go, be not renewed because of the increased cost. I think PIR is kind of underestimating the impact of this unlimited pricing increase. But going back to who talks about this the most, I think people that own 1 or 2 domain names don't really have the time to follow ICANN and follow all of its policies. It's the people that do own more than one domain name or own valuable domain names that are perhaps more keenly aware of the impacts of ICANN policies. So I think it's not really fair to say that it's only one segment of the population that's talking about it. It's really the people that are the most informed that are really representative of all registrants, even though their own portfolios are more highly valued than a typical registrant. The concerns should be for everybody. Like you might own one .org domain name. That domain name might be very valuable to you. And if, for example, you learn later on that if you get a URS complaint, you only have a couple of weeks to respond to that. Otherwise, by default, there'll be a default decision without your input. So if you go on a 3-week vacation, you find out that you might have lost your .org, or at least have it suspended, and have your business disrupted accordingly. And there's all kinds of issues with the URS that don't have the balance that even the UDRP has. Like Jonathan talked about how it's a simpler process. Basically has a lower cost. It's only a couple $100, like $250 or $300 compared to around $1,000 for the UDRP. But it was supposed to have a higher evidentiary burden on the trademark holders. It was supposed to be like for really egregious examples of cyber squatting, where it's a no-brainer. However, in practice, that's not really the case. Like, I'll give you a couple of examples. There's if you go to domains.adrforum.com, you could search the past decisions of the URS, and there are a couple involving bcg.top and bcg.000, and basically various acronym domains for BCG. I think of bcg.app. And there's only a few people in the chat room, but can you guess what BCG stands for? Or at least who the trademark holder is? I see people shaking their heads. It's for the world famous Boston Consulting Group. Obviously, every trademark holder thinks that their domain name is world famous and everybody should be aware of it. But this isn't an example of something like Google or Verizon where there's really only one user. The two registrants involved hadn't even built a website yet, so the domain names were inactive, and they're from China, so they probably weren't aware of Boston Consulting Group. They might have been thinking of something like Bitcoin Group or Beijing Consulting something group or whatever, something totally unrelated to Boston Consulting Group, but or Beijing Cooking Group or something. Who knows? Acronyms, dictionary words, they tend to have multiple competing uses. But in this case, the URS panelists, just gave them the domain name, or not gave them the domain name, but gave them the win. And so the domains were suspended. Under the URS, there's no transfer of the domain name compared to the UDRP, which does have a transfer option. Some of the trademark holders want to actually reform the URS to add a transfer option, kind of turning it into a cheaper version of the UDRP. And so it's these kinds of issues that the typical registrant isn't aware of because they're not following the policies closely. Like they'll see URS mentioned in section 500 of a 1,000-point registration agreement that they just click through. I know Jonathan's smiling because he knows the score on this. But somebody that has a more valuable portfolio will be more keenly aware of the issues. So I think having this discussion before these policies are imposed on registrants is important, and having ICANN just impose them as is. They should have just waited before the RPM PDP finished its work, and if they became consensus policies, they would become consensus policies. To add 10 million .org domain names to be exposed to this procedure, I think is quite a dangerous thing. Happy to talk about the fees aspect, but if people want to keep talking,
if we can segue to the fee issue, okay.
Did Jonathan want to speak first, or shall I go? Or
thanks, George. I think I did a level set already, so why don't you launch in and as you did before, you're doing great. Thank
Just 1 second. Eduardo had his hand up. Is it a question before we get into fees from you, Eduardo? Okay, I don't hear Eduardo. Eduardo, we can't hear you. You're muted. He's going crazy here. Okay, doesn't look like. Okay, you'll have to hold that question until you get your mic issue. Okay, let's go. Go ahead, George.
Okay, George Gricos here again, and so as folks might be aware, the registry operators for .org, info, biz already have the ability to raise prices 10% per year per domain name. That's a pretty big allowable increase, and that came after a prior contract that created a huge controversy, which not only allowed unlimited price increases, but allowed people to have different domain renewal prices on each domain name. So you could have, for example, a different price for math.org. It could be $10,000 a year compared to blah blah blah.org, which is only $1 per domain name per year. So that issue about differential or variable pricing was a debate that was had many years ago. And once I spotted that issue in the contracts, it generated a huge amount of feedback from registrants, thousands of comments to the ICANN public forums. And so after hearing that, they eliminated that loophole in terms of pricing and brought in the pricing caps of 10% a year, which are still very high, but at least it would be equal in all domains. Now the registry operators and ICANN negotiate an agreement to remove those price caps entirely. So instead of 10% a year per domain name, they can increase it 100%, 1,000%. We've seen the gTLD space where there are tens of thousands of percent increases in fees per year. In my view, that's a huge issue that ICANN is doing this without considering the needs of all affected stakeholders. Why do you have a domain name in the first place? I think people want it because it's permanent, and they want to put it in a book. They want to put it on a DVD. They want to know 20, 30 years from now they'll still have that domain name if they want it, and that URL will still resolve. And they consider themselves to be the owner of that domain name. Under these agreements, though, it's as though the registry operator themselves is considering themselves the owner, and considering the registrants just to be temporary tenants that they could replace if they just raise the fees high enough. And so I give the example in a prior discussion of an apartment building. You consider yourself the owner of a condo that's worth maybe $1 million. Would you give the electrical supplier a monopoly on the fees that they could charge for electricity? I think not, because let's suppose that the market price of electricity is $100 a month for a condo unit. If that electricity supplier, supplier of an essential service, decides that they want to raise the price to $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month, they essentially are taxing the owners of the condo unit based on what the value of the condo is, and it has no reflection of what the actual underlying cost of the electricity is, or what electricity costs elsewhere. It's the fact that they're essentially turning themselves into a tax of the condo residents because they have them at their mercy. And the registry operators themselves, they don't actually do the same things for themselves. Like PIR has affiliates running their back end, and affiliates doesn't have a monopoly on that contract. PIR, Public Interest Registry, has had tender processes where other registry operators could bid on that contract. And we don't know what the price is. We can probably go to the Form 990s, IRS Form 990s, to infer what the price is. But it was probably a couple of bucks per domain name per year. So PIR is making a huge profit, given that the wholesale cost of domain names is about $10 per domain per year. That's to registrars. And their underlying costs charged by affiliates are probably on the order of $2 per domain name per year or less. And so having that fee go even higher, just represents a huge windfall for them, and it's totally unrelated to their costs. To give another example, the .in CCTLD for India had a tender process, and Ustar won that contract for 70 cents per domain name per year, so less than $1 per domain name per year. So under competition, where we had the ability to remove PIR completely, fees should be going down and not be going up. So I think what will happen is that people will gravitate to .com, where there is that price certainty given that the Department of Commerce, Department of Justice is looking over their shoulder and saying, they can't raise the prices more than, 6 or 7% per year. And .org will be making a huge mistake if they, allow this contract to go through, because it will totally undermine the trust in their stewardship of that domain, of that top-level domain. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That was very, very good. Eduardo, did you want to comment on that, or did you have a question from something else? And I know Jonathan will probably want to respond to that. So turn to Eduardo first.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I know I wanted to comment on the issue about the URS and the URDP. I was going to give my experience from the end user.
Yeah, okay. Is it okay, guys? All right.
I own about 20 domains that I've been doing since 2000, I don't know, 1994, 1998, 2000. And there was only one case that I got a company, I don't remember who it was, that sent me saying that I was using a name that had their name in between what I had. But other than that, I never had an experience with the UDRP. I never, like Jonathan, and never got really, some of the things that you're mentioning now are a surprise to me of, in terms of which way it's heading. So I just wanted to give you my experience as end user, low end user. Thank you.
Now, before you go, Eduardo, just on the issue that was brought up by George on the pricing issue and how it affects .org, as a former chapter head for ISOC Puerto Rico, is there any concerns for you to go back on this issue that PIR should consider?
I'm sorry, when he was talking, I was changing from one computer to but if you can summarize me what happened, I can probably give you some input.
Okay, so as George was elaborating, we're looking at uncapping the fees, and so it's going to impact the price points of PIR. So as a person deeply involved with ISOC, as a former ISOC Puerto Rico chapter chair, is there anything that your opinions on this issue?
Well, what I'm afraid of is if there is not a cap, it's like what George said before, they can increase it 100%. And to me, maybe I'm a low user, and an increase of 100% might not be a big deal from what I'm paying now, in the sense that, I have a couple of 3 or 4 .org. But still, what happens if next year it increases? It's like the cable company. They tell you this is how much, and then every year they go up. You say, when this is going to end? And the problem is that once you have a domain and you have a business, you're stuck for life. It's like your name. Suddenly, you have a website that everybody knows. It's like taking Google, and now Google goes away, and it's called search engine or something like that. It's the same analogy in terms of the business. And you're stuck, and what happens? You pay, and you will keep paying. If you have a gap in that, then you are not protected at all, because who are you going to complain to?
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to turn to Jonathan. Reflections on what George was saying.
Thanks, Glenn. Jonathan Zuck again for the record. And again, this is another area where I think we'll start to see real distinctions between high volume purchasers of domains and individual purchasers of domains, or small volume purchasers, or even medium ones like me and Eduardo with our tens of domains. Again, if you're a very high volume purchaser, you're very sensitive to any price hikes whatsoever, right? If you've got a lot of domains, even a small price hike is going to be very dramatic. The other issue that I think is going to distinguish you as a high volume purchaser is that you're more interested in value creation happening in the secondary market than you are in the primary market. So in other words, the idea, if I'm a high volume purchaser of domains, I would like to think of a registry as the electric company or something like that, like a utility that's just being hired for a service, because I want the business of domains to happen someplace else in the auction houses and the other secondary market. And so you're thinking about the marketplace differently than what I would call a more typical registrant that's got a few domains that is less affected by this. And so again, I think it's important to sort of keep those categories, and they both matter. They're both legitimate stakeholders. I don't mean to suggest one is more important than the other, but their interests are different and not always entirely in sync. So I'll begin by saying, again, this is an attempt to standardize contracts. And George mentioned why standardize on the most recent one, since the new gTLD program has a lot of issues. And I think that's true. I'm not sure how many of them are tied to their contracts, but it's simply the most recent registry agreement. And there's a lot of stuff in it besides just these two issues that people are talking about harmonization. But the real importance of harmonization is that if we have a consensus policy that gets adopted in the future, it will affect all the contracts the same way. And so that standardization has innate value. And in that, if we decide later on that there's a problem, we can impose rules on the group as a whole because of the standardized contract. George mentions in the queue that .org might lose 50% of their registrants if they engage in price hikes. And that's an interesting statement to make, because that would be a good reason for them not to. The alternative is somehow saving them from themselves or something like that. And I think that's a tougher call to make. What we want is the marketplace to actually develop, in which we understand what the real primary marketplace for domain names looks like. And what we discovered, our economists on the CCT review, is that information is because of the caps and because of the secrecy, we don't really know what the wholesale value of a TLD is. And so it was tough to discover what the price elasticity was. In other words, at what price are you willing to switch domain names? And sure, if you made a huge investment in one like a Google, it might be more valuable to you and your switching cost is higher. But I've had domain names that I've gone back and changed because somebody offered me money for them, and I found a way to make it worthwhile to change them. So a lot of it is having a healthy primary market for these domains is partly dependent both on more transparency and on knowing what the market value is. And right now we don't. And I think some of the problems associated with the new gTLD program is that if I don't have economy of scale, if I'm a new TLD and I've got like a $25,000 minimum payment to ICANN, et cetera, I have to set a particular price for my domain, whether the market will bear it or not. And in a way, the low prices created by these caps create a kind of predation. In other words, they create a false competition for the new domains that wouldn't exist if all the prices were allowed to kind of move around and find their water level. And so I guess that's, again, what I would advocate and what our economist on the CCT was advocating, which is sort of, let's figure out what that water level is and let .org find out what the number is, at which point people start running away, because I guarantee you they'll notice and they'll start reining things in. I think one additional point that's important for the average registrant to remember is that we do have established consensus policy that does exist in the new contracts, that if you do make a price hike, you have the right to buy a registry or domain name for 10 more years at the existing price, if they announce a price hike. So that it's not so much like you'll wake up on Monday morning and suddenly owe them a bunch of money for your renewal. I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation around price in this marketplace if we allow it to happen. And I think standardizing the contracts is actually going to give the community greater and more consistent control over how the system works than we have now with the piecemeal implementation that's a result of all these legacy contracts that have happened over time.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to give George any final comments.
Yeah, just three. We're running out of time, I think. In terms of the typical registrant, the typical registrant only owns about 15 domain names in total, so only one might be a .org, and so they don't really have the time to look at the issues as carefully as somebody that owns more than the average domain name. So, but the interests of a higher volume registrant and an average registrant are still completely aligned. So to look at the phone example, a business that has 100 phone lines is still going to be the same issue alignment as a person that owns one phone line. They all want to have the lowest possible cost of service of that phone line. and to have regulatory price increases that are allowed beyond a reasonable level. The company with 100 phone lines is probably going to be more actively engaged on that issue than the one that has only one phone line, because that one phone line might increase by $10 a month, whereas if you have 100 phone lines, it would obviously have a much bigger financial impact, which is worth having lawyers and being engaged in processes and so on. In terms of the 10-year protection, that's really an inadequate protection, because at some point the bill will come due, and so if you're having a website and know that the costs are going to increase in 10 years, and you want to sell your developed website, the cost of those future increases is going to negatively affect the value of your website. And so that's going to have a direct impact, because if you look at the value of a domain name, really it's the future benefits minus the future costs, all discounted to today. And if you're going to have unlimited price increases allowed, you have to subtract those much higher costs in terms of, and that will reduce the value of the domain name. In terms of the economists, I don't know which economists Jonathan was speaking about, but there's a fine distinction that people have to be aware of. There's the value of the domain name, and so some people will call that the price of the domain name, and there's the actual fees for the registry services. The registry services are actually very limited. All they do is manage the central database of domain names, making sure there's how those are allocated, etc. So it's basically the zone file, and that will be reflected in the WHOIS database at some point, and allowing the domain name to resolve. So if you own, for example, the domain name example.org with name servers ns1.example.org and ns2.example.org, a browser trying to resolve example.org will essentially have the query sent to the registry operator. What are the name servers for this domain name? And the registry operator will return, ns1.example.org and ns2.example.org are the name servers. That's all the registry operator essentially does. And so what is the fees for those specific services? That's all that one should be concerned about. When people talk about the price for registry services, that's really associated with what's the maximum price we can get away for charging for these fees. And what the registries are doing is instead of looking at what the actual costs of those specific registry services are, they're saying, well, look at these people that own domain names that are worth thousands of dollars. What are these domain names going to be? What's the maximum amount we can tax these registrants and still keep them renewing? So it's kind of like a game of chicken to some extent. Can we get away with charging them $30 a year? Can we get away with charging them $50 a year? Maybe you can, because the discounted value of those costs will still be higher, still be less than the underlying value of the domain name. But at some point, that tax, which has no relation to the actual cost of providing the service, gets high enough that people decide enough is enough. I'm going to let this domain name expire and not renew it anymore. And so the economists are kind of playing a game here, because they're not looking at the actual fees that would exist if you tendered that registry contract. They're essentially flipping the equation, flipping things 180 degrees and saying, what's the most we can charge the registrant for still maintaining the domain name. So the registries are kind of treating the registrants as just tenants instead of owners in their own sense. The registrants, I believe, own the domain name, and the registries are just service providers. The registries are trying to flip that over and saying, we're the owners, we're going to charge you as much as we can. And that's like a totally different philosophy, and not really supported by history, where these were just subcontractors of ICANN to do a specific service. It wasn't supposed to be a giveaway to the registry operators to make them the owners of the domain of the TLD.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. I'm going to turn to Jonathan. He's got a couple of final comments, and we'll wrap up as soon as he's done. So go ahead, Jonathan.
Thanks, Glenn. And this is a great conversation, and thanks for setting this up, Glenn, and thanks, George, for participating. I think part of the problem is a philosophical one, and one is maybe a practical one, which is that we may have wanted historically to really maintain this as a service provider relationship to ICANN, but it has evolved very differently. I mean, the registries that are out there are involved in hardcore competition with each other. .com is in competition with .de in Germany, for example, and they go and they market .com in Germany to try and get people to buy those domains. And so I think it's not feasible to simply compare a registry to a registry service provider in that way. Registries are trying to make a business and trying to promote their TLDs and try to sell them and compete with other TLD registries. And so there is a market, a primary market as well. You know, if we're going to have a price regulation across the board, then let's make sure it includes the secondary market as well. And I think people will cry a lot louder about that. So let's continue the conversation. But I think, again, the bottom line is, I think standardizing the contracts will in fact give the community a much clearer view of what's going on and give them a more consistent mechanism of control over the TLD marketplace.
Great. You know, it's been a great conversation. I enjoyed it a lot, and Eduardo had to leave, but the recording has been done and I'll share it with the community. But definitely there's more to talk about this. Any deadlines that we need to be aware of in terms of comments on this, Jonathan? What's the open period for comment?
Yeah, it turns out there's a lot of agreements coming up that in the fairly short term, so we should be discussing this pretty aggressively over the next month or so. But the .org agreement is one of the first ones coming up, and so for the at-large to reach some consensus on that in time, I think is going to be tough. But I think we need to, as George said, April 29th.
Right.
I think we need to build some consensus sooner rather than later, so that as we discussed on the CPWG call today, we might come up with a global consensus around some of these things within the at-large that we can then apply across the board of these renewals.
Great. Well, again, thanks, guys. I'm grateful to Zoom allowing us to extend this call a little longer. It was roughly over the 40 minutes, but it went well. So thank you both for, maybe we can do this another time. So, but again, I'll share this with the at-large group, and we'll chat to you both another time. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.